The dive charter captain's name was Elena Vasquez, and she had been running recreational dives out of Key West for 19 years, long enough to know every reef, every wreck, every coral head and sand patch from the Marquesas to the dry Tortugas. She had started diving in her early 20s, working as a dive master for other charter operations, saving money and learning the business until she could afford to buy her own boat. A 42-foot Newton dive boat she named La Sirena, equipped with a compressor, a camera table and enough tank racks to accommodate 12 divers plus crew. She had built a reputation as one of the most knowledgeable and safety-conscious operators in the Keys, someone who could find the best sites in any conditions and who never took unnecessary risks with her clients. On the morning of March 8, 2024, she was taking a group of 6 advanced divers to a site locals called the Cathedral, a system of coral caves and swim-throughs about 12 miles southwest of Key West, depth ranging from 60 to 110 feet, the kind of place that attracted experienced divers who wanted something more challenging than the standard reef tours. The Cathedral was not an official name, not something you'd find on charts or in guidebooks, but it had been called that for as long as anyone could remember, named by divers who had first explored the site in the 1970s and had been struck by the way the coral formations created arched passageways and chambers that looked like the interior of a church, with light filtering through cracks in the reef ceiling like stained glass windows. The water that morning was unusually clear, visibility pushing 100 feet, the kind of conditions that made every dive memorable. The Gulf Stream was running gentle, just a mild current that wouldn't trouble anyone who knew how to navigate it, and the surface was calm, barely a ripple, the sky a deep, unbroken blue that promised good weather for the rest of the day. Vasquez briefed her divers on the boat, going over the dive plan, the entry and exit points, the maximum depth and time limits, the hand signals they would use underwater. The group consisted of 2 couples and 2 solo divers, all with at least 50 log dives, all comfortable with depth and overhead environments. One of the solo divers was a man named Robert Chen, 46 years old, from San Francisco, a software engineer by profession and a passionate technical diver by inclination. Chen had over 1,000 log dives, certifications in cave diving and wreck penetration, and a methodical approach to exploration that came from years of training and experience. He carried 2 dive computers, redundant lights, and a high-end underwater camera system that he used to document every dive. He was the kind of diver who noticed details, who investigated every anomaly, who couldn't pass a dark crevice or unexplored passage without wanting to see what was inside. The group descended the mooring line at 09:35, finning down through shafts of sunlight that turned the water electric blue, their bubbles rising in silver streams toward the surface. They followed Vasquez as she led them toward the main cavern entrance at 85 feet, swimming through clouds of bait fish that parted and reformed around them like living curtains. The cathedral earned its name from the way the coral formations created arched passageways and chambers, elkhorn and staghorn coral growing in intricate patterns that had taken decades to form, brain coral the size of cars, sea fans swaying in the gentle current like congregation members caught in prayer. The group made their way through the outer chambers, past schools of yellowtail snapper that moved as a single organism, past a massive grouper that had claimed one of the archways as its territory and eyed the divers with ancient suspicion. They were 20 minutes into the dive, nitrogen loading building in their tissues at a rate that Vasquez tracked carefully on her computer, when Chen gestured to her and pointed toward a narrow side passage she usually skipped because it led to a dead-end chamber with nothing particularly interesting inside. The passage was marked by a pair of massive coral heads that formed natural pillars, and most divers passed it without noticing. Chen was insistent, jabbing his finger toward the passage, and Vasquez nodded and followed. She had learned over the years to trust experienced divers when they saw something worth investigating, and Chen had been polite and professional throughout the trip, not the kind of diver who would waste time on nothing. The passage narrowed to barely shoulder width, coral-encrusted walls on both sides, close enough that Vasquez had to turn sideways in places to avoid contact, careful not to brush against the fragile polyps. The passage descended slightly, dropping to 90 feet, then opened into a small chamber about 15 feet across and maybe 12 feet high at the center. The chamber was mostly empty, just sand and broken coral, and a few spiny lobsters hiding in crevices, their antennae twitching at the disturbance. But wedged into a crack in the back wall, at a depth of 92 feet according to Vasquez's dive computer, was something that stopped her cold. It was a military-style footlocker, aluminum construction, about 3 feet long and 18 inches wide and maybe 2 feet deep, covered in algae and encrusted with coral polyps and barnacles that had grown thick over years of submersion. It was secured to the rock with what looked like climbing webbing, the kind of nylon strapping that cavers and rock climbers used, deliberately placed, deliberately hidden in a spot where casual divers would never see it. Chen pointed at it, looked at Vasquez with raised eyebrows behind his mask. She checked her air gauge. They had maybe 15 minutes of bottom time left before they needed to start ascending to stay within no decompression limits, and swam closer, her heart rate picking up. The locker was heavy-duty, the kind of thing you'd use to store gear on a boat or tools in a garage, with reinforced corners and a hasp and padlock arrangement that had long since corroded into a solid mass of rust and marine growth. There were no markings visible beneath the growth, no identifying features, no labels or tags, just the locker and the webbing and the question of what it was doing, wedged into a coral cave 90 feet below the surface, 12 miles from the nearest shore. Vasquez made the decision not to touch it, Rule 1 of recreational diving, the rule she drilled into every student and client. You don't disturb things you find underwater, especially things that have clearly been placed deliberately. The locker could be lost property, could be illegal dumping, could be drug smuggling paraphernalia, could be evidence in a crime. The ocean floor around the Keys was littered with the detritus of human activity. Boats dumped illegally, garbage thrown overboard, even bodies weighted and dropped in deep water where they would never be found. Touching something without knowing what it was could be dangerous, could contaminate evidence, could even be illegal if it turned out to be part of an active investigation. She gestured to Chen that they were leaving it, that they would report it when they surfaced. Chen nodded, understanding immediately, and took several photographs with his underwater camera, capturing the locker from multiple angles, making sure to get shots that showed its position relative to the chamber entrance, its dimensions, its condition. He was methodical about it, a habit from his technical diving training where documentation was critical. They backed out of the chamber, finning carefully to avoid stirring up sediment, and rejoined the rest of the group in the main cavern. When the group surfaced 45 minutes later, after a safety stop at 15 feet to off-gas nitrogen and another few minutes at the surface while the boat crew helped them aboard, Vasquez immediately went to the VHF radio and called the Coast Guard on Channel 16. She reported the find, gave the GPS coordinates from her chart plotter, described what they had seen in detail. The Coast Guard watch officer on duty took the information, asked clarifying questions about the size, condition, and exact location of the locker, and said they would send someone to investigate. He asked Vasquez to email any photographs to the Coast Guard Investigative Service Office in Key West and to keep the location confidential until an investigation could be conducted. 2 days later, on March 10th, a Coast Guard Maritime Safety and Security Team dive unit came out to the cathedral aboard a 45-foot response boat. The team consisted of 6 personnel, 3 divers, a boat crew, and a senior chief who was coordinating the operation. They brought specialized equipment, underwater cameras, evidence bags, lift bags for recovery, and metal detectors in case the locker was part of a larger cache. The senior chief's name was Marcus Holland, and he had been with the Coast Guard Investigative Service for 14 years, working cases that ranged from drug smuggling to illegal dumping to occasional homicides that occurred in maritime waters. Holland had reviewed the photographs that Chen had sent, and he had done some preliminary research. The cathedral was known to local law enforcement as a potential drop site for smugglers. The depth and remoteness made it attractive for hiding contraband, and there had been cases in the past where drugs or cash had been recovered from the area. But a footlocker secured to the reef with webbing was unusual. Most smugglers used weighted bags or packages that would be easy to retrieve, not something as bulky and difficult to move as a footlocker. The dive team descended at 11:20, following a weighted line to the chamber entrance. Holland stayed on the boat, monitoring the divers via underwater communication system, watching their progress on a dive computer display that showed their depth, remaining air, and elapsed time. The divers located the locker within minutes, confirmed its position, and began documenting the site. They photographed the locker from every angle, measured it, took video footage showing the surrounding chamber, and used a metal detector to check for other objects nearby. They found nothing else. One of the divers examined the webbing that secured the locker to the reef. It was professional grade, the kind used in rescue operations or marine salvage, secured with carabiners that had corroded but were still intact. Whoever had placed the locker had known what they were doing, had taken care to ensure it wouldn't drift or dislodge even in heavy surge or strong currents. The diver cut the webbing with a dive knife, carefully to avoid damaging the locker or disturbing the contents, and attached a lift bag. They inflated the bag with air from their tanks, and the locker slowly ascended, stabilizing at the safety stop depth while the divers followed. When the locker reached the surface, the boat crew hauled it aboard using a davit. It was heavy, waterlogged, dripping seawater and fragments of marine growth. Holland examined it carefully, noting the construction, the corrosion patterns, the barnacle accumulation. The barnacles were old growth, multiple layers, the kind that took years to accumulate. This locker had been underwater for a long time. They transported it back to the Coast Guard station at Key West, a facility on Truman Avenue that served as the headquarters for Sector Key West and the home port for multiple cutters and small boats. Holland took the locker to the evidence processing room, a climate-controlled space with workbenches and examination equipment. The locker was X-rayed before anyone attempted to open it, standard procedure for anything that might contain weapons, explosives, or hazardous materials. The X-ray showed what appeared to be documents, plastic bags, and several hard rectangular objects that could have been books or electronic devices. No obvious weapons, no batteries or wiring that would suggest an explosive device, no cylinders that might indicate compressed gas or chemical agents. Holland assembled a team to open the locker. They wore gloves and used bolt cutters on the corroded padlock, which snapped with minimal effort. The hasp was more difficult, corroded to the point where it had fused with the locker body, and they had to use a pry bar to carefully separate the lid from the base without damaging the contents. When the lid finally opened, revealing the interior, Holland felt his breath catch. The inside of the locker was dry. The seal had held. Whoever had placed this locker underwater had taken extraordinary care to ensure it would remain watertight, using gaskets and sealant and multiple layers of protection. The contents were wrapped in heavy-duty waterproof bags, the kind used by military and commercial divers, thick plastic with airtight zippers and double seals designed to keep equipment dry even at depth. There were 4 bags, each sealed and labeled with black marker on white tape. Holland opened the first bag. Inside were documents, logbooks, printed emails, handwritten notes and photographs, all organized in clear plastic sleeves. The second bag contained electronic devices, a dive computer, a handheld GPS unit in a waterproof case, a USB flash drive in a sealed container, and what looked like a small voice recorder. The third bag held personal items: a wallet, a wedding ring, a watch, a cell phone in a protective case. The fourth bag contained more photographs, dozens of them, along with a laminated note that was folded once and sealed in its own plastic sleeve. Holland opened the wallet first. Inside was a Florida driver's license issued to Thomas Michael Brenner, date of birth June 12, 1978, address listed as 242 Coral Drive, Marathon, Florida. The license photo showed a man in his late 30s with sandy brown hair, blue eyes, and a slight smile. There were credit cards in the wallet: Visa, MasterCard, American Express, all in Thomas Brenner's name. There was $240 in cash, mostly 20s, and there were business cards for Brenner Marine Services, with Thomas Brenner listed as owner and operator, phone number and email address printed below. Holland set the wallet aside and picked up the laminated note. It was written in careful block letters on waterproof paper, the kind that technical divers used for writing slates. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the work of someone who had taken time to compose their thoughts. Holland read it aloud to the team. "If you're reading this, then we didn't make it. My name is Thomas Brenner. The truth is in these logs. Please make sure our families know what happened. We tried to do the right thing. We reported what we found, and they came after us because of it. If you're law enforcement, look at the photographs, look at the dates, look at the evidence. The men responsible are named in the logs. Don't let them get away with this. Don't let our deaths be for nothing." Holland set the note down and reached for the first logbook. It was a small, waterproof notebook, spiral-bound, the pages filled with Thomas Brenner's handwriting. The entries were dated from March 2017 through April 2, 2017, covering a span of about 3 weeks. Holland turned to the first page and began to read. The entry was dated March 15, 2017, and it described a dive that Thomas and his wife Catherine had made to the Thunderbolt wreck, a decommissioned Coast Guard cutter that had been intentionally sunk in 1986 to create an artificial reef about 6 miles south of Marathon. The Thunderbolt was one of the most popular dive sites in the Keys, sitting upright on a sandy bottom at 120 feet, its superstructure rising to within 70 feet of the surface. Thomas wrote that he and Catherine had been diving the wreck to take photographs, just the two of them, while their kids stayed with Catherine's parents for the weekend. "About 100 feet down on the sand next to the hull," Thomas had written, "I found what looked like a commercial fishing trap, but it was made wrong. The frame was aluminum instead of wood or plastic, and the mesh was way too fine for lobster or stone crab. It was weighted with dive weights, at least 20 pounds, like someone wanted it to stay exactly where it was and not drift with the current. Inside the trap were plastic-wrapped packages, maybe 10 or 12 of them, each one about the size of a brick, wrapped tight in layers of plastic and tape. I didn't touch them. I took photographs with my dive camera. When we got back to the boat, I looked at the photos on my computer and zoomed in. I could see enough detail to know what they were. Cocaine. Had to be at least 20 kilos, maybe more. Someone's using the wrecks to store drugs, probably waiting until the heat dies down before they retrieve them. I reported it to the Coast Guard as soon as we got back to shore. They said they'd investigate immediately." Holland felt a chill run through him. He flipped to the next entry, dated March 18, 2017. Coast Guard came out yesterday with a dive team. They recovered the trap and all the packages. The boarding officer who took my statement, a guy named Lieutenant Morrison, told me they'd arrested 3 men in Marathon who were connected to the drop. He said I might be called to testify if the case went to trial. He also told me to be careful, that drug smugglers don't like witnesses, that I should watch my back and report anything suspicious. I told him I wasn't worried. Catherine thinks I'm overreacting. Maybe she's right. But I've been around boats and the water my whole life, and I know these people don't play games." The entries continued, each one dated, each one documenting Thomas Brenner's growing concern. March 22nd. Saw a boat I didn't recognize tied up at the marina this morning. 3 men aboard, all of them watching our slip, watching our boat. I walked past them on the dock, tried to get a look at their faces. One of them had a scar on his face, a long white line running from his temple down to his jaw. They didn't say anything, just stared at me. I wrote down their boat registration number, FL4782BX. White center console, maybe 34 feet, twin Yamaha outboards. The boat left around noon. Could be nothing, could be coincidence, but something about the way they were looking at me made my skin crawl. March 25th. The boat came back yesterday. Same 3 guys. They tied up at the transient slips again, stayed for about 2 hours, then left. I talked to the dockmaster, a guy named Ralph Tucker. Asked him if he knew who they were. He said they'd paid cash for the slip, said they were cruising, didn't give names. I showed him the registration number and he said he'd check into it. Catherine thinks I'm being paranoid. She says there are lots of boats that come through the marina, that I'm seeing connections where there aren't any. But I don't think so. These guys are watching us. March 28th. Got 3 phone calls this morning, all from blocked numbers. Each time I answered, there was just breathing on the other end, heavy breathing like someone was trying to intimidate me. Then they'd hang up. 3rd time it happened, Catherine was standing next to me and heard it. She doesn't think I'm paranoid anymore. I called the Monroe County Sheriff's Office and filed a report. The deputy who took the information said there wasn't much they could do unless the caller made a direct threat, but he logged it and said they'd increase patrols in our area. I also called Lieutenant Morrison at the Coast Guard and told him what was happening. He said he'd look into it, see if there was any connection to the drug case. April was. Decision time. Catherine and I talked for a long time last night after the kids went to bed. We're scheduled to take the boat out tomorrow, just a family day trip, fishing and swimming, something we do at least once a month. I thought about cancelling, about staying close to shore until this whole thing blows over. But Catherine pointed out that we can't live our lives in fear. She's right. These guys want to intimidate us, want us to be scared, want us to stop cooperating with law enforcement. If we give in, if we hide, then they win. So we're going. But I'm taking precautions. I'm bringing the satellite phone fully charged. I'm bringing the EPIRB, I'm bringing flares, extra life jackets, the handheld VHF, and I'm documenting everything. I've printed out all my photos of the men at the marina, all my notes about the suspicious calls and the boat that's been following us. I'm putting it all in this locker, along with copies of the Coast Guard reports and my testimony. If something happens to us, I want there to be a record. I want people to know why. April 2nd, 2017. The final entry. It's 7 in the morning. We're leaving in about an hour. Weather looks perfect. Catherine's making sandwiches for lunch. Emma and Lucas are excited. They love being on the boat. I've checked all the safety gear twice. Everything's ready. I'm probably worrying about nothing. Probably just a couple of guys who happened to be at the marina at the same time we were. Probably just coincidence. But I've learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts are telling me something's wrong, so I'm sealing this locker. I'm taking it with me on the boat, and if we get a chance, I'm going to hide it somewhere no one will find it unless they're looking specifically. The Cathedral Caves, maybe. I dove there last month and found a good spot, a side chamber that most divers don't know about. If you're reading this, then something went wrong. My family and I are probably dead. The Coast Guard has the drugs I found, but they might not have the full context. There are photos in this locker showing the men I saw at the marina. The white center console, registration FL4782BX. One of the men has a distinctive scar. If I'm dead, it's because of what I saw, because I reported it. Make sure the people responsible are held accountable. Make sure my wife and kids didn't die for nothing. Holland set the logbook down and looked at his team. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Everyone understood what they were looking at. This wasn't lost property. This wasn't illegal dumping. This was evidence in a murder case, a case that had been cold for 7 years, a case where a family had vanished without a trace, and where the prevailing theory had been accidental drowning. If you've stayed with me this far, then you already know this story is about to take you into the darkest corners of drug trafficking and witness intimidation. And if you want to see how investigators turned a waterproof locker and a dead man's journal into a case that would finally deliver justice, then stick around, because what comes next is the kind of painstaking detective work that separates cold cases that stay cold from the ones that get solved. Holland pulled up the Coast Guard database on his computer and searched for incidents involving Thomas Brenner. The search returned an immediate hit. A missing persons case opened on April 3, 2017. Holland opened the file and read, Thomas Michael Brenner, age 38. Catherine Ann Brenner, age 36. Emma Rose Brenner, age 9. Lucas James Brenner, age 6. Family of 4 reported missing after their 38-foot sport fishing boat named Relentless had failed to return from a day trip out of Marathon. The boat had been found on April 5, 2017, drifting approximately 30 miles south of Key West. Engine still running in neutral, fuel tank 3/4 full, no one aboard. The Coast Guard had conducted an extensive search covering over 3,000 square miles of ocean between Marathon and the dry Tortugas. No bodies had been recovered. No life raft had been found. No debris field. The case had been classified as a missing persons incident, probable cause drowning, with no evidence of foul play. Holland felt his stomach tighten. He had worked enough cases to know that when a boat was found intact with the engine running and no one aboard, it usually meant one of 2 things. Either someone had fallen overboard and the others had jumped in to rescue them, or something violent had happened and the perpetrators had staged the scene to look like an accident. Thomas Brenner's logs suggested the latter. Holland called the Monroe County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak to whoever had handled the original missing persons investigation. He was connected to Detective Sergeant Sarah Vega, who was in the Criminal Investigations Division. Holland explained who he was, what had been found, and asked if she had time to come to the Coast Guard station to review the evidence. Vega said she could be there in 90 minutes. She sounded cautious on the phone, the way investigators always sounded when cold cases resurfaced with new evidence, hopeful but guarded, not wanting to get ahead of what the evidence might actually prove. While waiting for Vega to arrive, Holland went through the rest of the materials in the locker. He pulled out the photographs that Thomas Brenner had collected. There were over 60 images, organized in plastic sleeves with dates written on each sleeve in marker. The first set showed the drug trap at the Thunderbolt wreck, the packages inside clearly visible, the surrounding area providing context for the location and depth. The photos were high quality, taken with a good underwater camera, sharp enough that you could see individual details. The second set of photographs showed the 3 men Thomas had mentioned in his logs. The images had been taken with a telephoto lens from what looked like the deck of a boat, zoomed in on a center console tied up at a marina dock. 3 men, all Hispanic, all in their 30s or 40s, fit and muscular in the way that suggested they worked physically for a living. One of the men had a distinctive scar running from his left temple down across his cheek to his jaw, a thick white line that stood out against his tanned skin. Another man was shorter, stocky, with a shaved head and a tattoo sleeve visible on his left arm. The third man was taller, lean, with close-cropped hair and sunglasses that hid his eyes. Holland scanned the photographs into the computer system, then ran facial recognition through the FBI's database. The system churned for several minutes, comparing the images against millions of records, and returned 3 matches with high confidence. The man with the scar was identified as Victor Manuel Ruiz, date of birth March 3, 1975, with an extensive criminal history. Holland pulled up Ruiz's file and read through it. Multiple arrests for drug trafficking, conspiracy to import narcotics, assault, resisting arrest. Ruiz had served time in federal prison twice, most recently released in 2015 after serving 8 years of a 15-year sentence for possession with intent to distribute. The second man was identified as Carlos Mendoza. Date of birth, August 17, 1978. Also with a significant criminal history. Possession, distribution, weapons charges. Mendoza had been arrested multiple times, but had always managed to avoid long prison sentences through plea deals and cooperation agreements, though his cooperation had apparently been selective and self-serving. The third man was Jorge Santos, date of birth November 2, 1980, with a less extensive record but still multiple arrests for drug-related offences. Holland cross-referenced the names with the boat registration number that Thomas Brenner had recorded, FL 4782BX. The registration came back to a boat named Fastbreak, a 34-foot yellowfin center console owned by Victor Manuel Ruiz, address listed in Tavernier, Florida. The boat had been registered in 2014 and was still active as of the database's last update. Holland pulled the Coast Guard case file for the drug seizure that Thomas Brenner had reported in March 2017. The file was substantial, running to over 200 pages of reports, photographs, evidence logs, and investigative summaries. The Coast Guard had recovered 23 kilograms of cocaine from the trap at the Thunderbolt wreck site, with a street value estimated at over $700,000. 3 men had been arrested: Victor Ruiz, Carlos Mendoza, and Jorge Santos. The arrests had been made on March 17, 2017, the day after the drugs were recovered. All 3 men had been charged with conspiracy to import and distribute narcotics, possession with intent to distribute, and use of a vessel to facilitate drug trafficking. The case had gone to trial in federal court in Miami. Ruiz and Mendoza had been convicted on all counts and sentenced to 15 years each in federal prison. Santos had pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence of 5 years. The prosecution had relied on the physical evidence, the drugs, the trap, forensic analysis linking the defendants to the trap through fingerprints and DNA, and on the testimony of a confidential informant who had provided information about the defendant's smuggling operation. Thomas Brenner had been listed as the reporting party in the Coast Guard's case file, but he had not been called to testify at trial because the evidence had been strong enough without him. But defense attorneys would have had access to the case file during discovery. They would have known that Thomas Brenner was the person who had found the drugs and reported them. And if Ruiz and Mendoza had wanted revenge, if they had wanted to send a message to anyone else who might think about cooperating with law enforcement, Thomas Brenner would have been the obvious target. Holland checked the prison records for Ruiz and Mendoza. Both men had been released early in December 2023 after serving approximately 6.5 years of their 15-year sentences. Early release for good behavior, participation in rehabilitation programs, and overcrowding in the federal prison system. They had been out for only 3 months when the locker was discovered. Detective Sergeant Vega arrived at the Coast Guard station at 13:45. She was in her mid-40s, compact and athletic, with short dark hair and sharp eyes that took in everything. Holland met her at the entrance, signed her in, and escorted her to the evidence room. He briefed her on what had been found, showed her the locker, the logbooks, the photographs, and walked her through Thomas Brenner's entries. Vega listened in silence, taking notes, asking occasional questions for clarification. When Holland finished, Vega sat back and exhaled slowly. "I remember this case," she said. "The Brenner family. It was one of those cases that haunted me because nothing made sense. The boat was intact, the engine was running, the weather had been perfect. No distress call, no EPIRB activation, no sign of struggle. We investigated every angle we could think of: accidental drowning, murder-suicide, intentional disappearance. Nothing fit. The family had no financial problems, no marital issues, no reason to disappear. Thomas Brenner ran a successful marine services business, boat repairs, diving equipment, that kind of thing. Catherine was a school teacher at Marathon Elementary, loved by her students and colleagues. The kids were happy, healthy, involved in sports and school activities. There was no motive for anything other than a tragic accident. "But you didn't know about the drug case," Holland said. "No. We checked for criminal history and found nothing. Clean records, both of them. If Thomas had been involved in a Coast Guard drug investigation, it wasn't flagged in any system we had access to, and the drug case itself probably wasn't connected to Marathon. It would have been federal jurisdiction, prosecuted in Miami, and unless we were specifically looking for a connection, we wouldn't have found it." Holland asked what the original investigation had concluded. Vega pulled out her phone and accessed the case file digitally. "We concluded it was most likely accidental drowning. Our theory was that one of the kids fell overboard and the parents jumped in to save them, and all four were swept away by currents. It was the only explanation that fit the evidence. The boat had been found drifting south, which was consistent with the prevailing currents. The life jackets were still in their storage compartment, which suggested whatever happened was sudden and unexpected, no time to grab safety gear. The EPIRB was in its bracket, not activated, which meant either they didn't have time to activate it or they didn't think they were in immediate danger. We searched for days, used aircraft and boats, covered hundreds of square miles. We never found anything." "What about the boat itself?" Holland asked. "Was it forensically examined?" "We did a basic inspection when it was recovered. Looked for signs of struggle, blood, damage to the hull or deck, anything that might indicate foul play or mechanical failure. We found nothing. The boat was in good condition. Engine was running fine. No leaks, no damage. We released it to the family's estate after about 2 weeks. Catherine Brenner's parents, Robert and Eleanor Hayes, took possession. They kept it for about a year, hoping the family would somehow be found alive, and then they sold it. Last I heard, it had changed hands a couple of times and was somewhere up the coast. Holland suggested they track down the boat and conduct a thorough forensic examination now, using luminol to check for blood traces that might have been cleaned or missed in the original inspection. Vega agreed. She made some calls and determined that the Relentless was currently registered to a couple named James and Patricia Thornton, living in Naples, Florida. The boat was kept at a marina called Tin City Marina on the Gordon River. Vega called the Thorntons and explained the situation, asked if they would consent to a forensic examination. The Thorntons were shocked to learn the boat's history. They had purchased it from a broker and had been told nothing about a missing family, but they agreed immediately to cooperate. Holland and Vega decided to coordinate with the FBI, since the case involved drug trafficking and crossed state lines, giving the Bureau jurisdiction. Vega called the FBI's Miami field office and spoke with the duty agent, explained what had been discovered. The duty agent connected her with Supervisory Special Agent David Chen, who headed the Organized Crime and Drug Enforcement Task Force. Chen listened to the briefing, asked several pointed questions, and said he would assign a team to the case immediately. He suggested a meeting at the Miami field office the following day to review the evidence and develop an investigative plan. The meeting took place on March 11, 2024, in a conference room at the FBI's Miami field office in Miramar. Present were Senior Chief Holland, Detective Sergeant Vega, Supervisory Special Agent Chen, 2 additional FBI agents, a prosecutor from the U.S., Attorney's Office, and a forensic specialist from the FBI's Evidence Response Team. They reviewed the contents of the locker, analyzed Thomas Brenner's logs, examined the photographs, and discussed the drug case that had preceded the family's disappearance. Chen laid out the investigative priorities. First, they needed to forensically examine the Relentless to look for physical evidence that might have been missed or cleaned. Second, They needed to interview everyone who had been involved in the original drug case, starting with Jorge Santos, who had cooperated and received a reduced sentence. Third, they needed to track the movements of Victor Ruiz and Carlos Mendoza on the day the Brenners disappeared, using cell phone records, financial transactions, and any other available data. Fourth, they needed to re-interview everyone who had been at the marina in Marathon during the weeks leading up to the disappearance, looking for witnesses who might have seen Ruiz and his associates. The forensic examination of the Relentless took place over 3 days, March 13th to 15, 2024, at Tin City Marina in Naples. The FBI's evidence response team brought specialized equipment, luminol and alternative light sources to detect blood traces, DNA swab kits, fingerprint powder and lifts, cameras and documentation equipment. They documented every inch of the boat, photographed every surface, and systematically searched for evidence. The boat had been well maintained by the Thorntons, who had no knowledge of its history and had treated it like any other recreational vessel. It had been cleaned regularly, repainted once, and the interior had been reupholstered. Any biological evidence from 2017 would have been degraded or destroyed by time and cleaning. But the forensic team was thorough, checking areas that people typically missed when cleaning: the bilge, the spaces behind and under equipment, the undersides of hatches, the crevices around fittings and hardware. On the second day of the examination, one of the forensic techs found something in the bilge, beneath the engine compartment. Wedged into a corner, hidden beneath the bilge pump and accessible only by removing the pump and reaching into a tight space, was a small plastic zip tie, the kind law enforcement used to secure prisoners' wrists. It was stained with what appeared to be old blood, the plastic discolored and brittle. The tech carefully extracted it using forceps, placed it in an evidence bag, and logged it. The lab analysis took a week. The blood on the zip tie was human, degraded by age and exposure to moisture, but sufficient for DNA extraction and profiling. The DNA profile was run through the FBI's Combined DNA Index system, the national database that contained profiles from convicted offenders, crime scenes, and missing persons cases. The system returned a match: Catherine Ann Brenner. The zip tie had been used to restrain Catherine Brenner, and it had ended up in the bilge of her family's boat, hidden in a place where it would only be found during a detailed forensic examination. Chen called Vega with the results. This was the physical evidence they needed, proof that Catherine Brenner had been restrained aboard the Relentless, which contradicted the accidental drowning theory. Someone had zip-tied Catherine's wrists, which meant someone had taken her and her family by force. This was not an accident. This was kidnapping, and almost certainly murder. The task force refocused their investigation on Victor Ruiz and Carlos Mendoza. They pulled phone records from April 2017, requesting data from all major carriers for the phone numbers associated with Ruiz, Mendoza, and Santos. The records showed that on April 3, 2017, the day the Brenner family was reported missing, all 3 men's phones had been active, pinging cell towers in a pattern that tracked from Marathon south toward Key West and then back north. The detailed analysis showed that Ruiz's phone had pinged a tower near the Marathon Marina at 07:43 a.m., consistent with someone being at or near the marina when the Brenners were preparing to leave. The phone then pinged towers progressively southward, tracking along the route that a boat would take heading toward Key West. At 14:22 p.m., Ruiz's phone pinged a tower near Key West, then went dark for approximately 3 hours. At 17:38 p.m., the phone came back online, pinging towers on the route back toward Marathon. Mendoza's and Santos's phones showed similar patterns, all 3 devices moving together, suggesting the men had been in the same location throughout the day. The task force cross-referenced the phone data with marine traffic information. The Coast Guard maintained AIS records, automatic identification system data from vessels equipped with transponders. but in 2017, AIS was still optional for recreational vessels, and many smaller boats didn't carry transponders. The Relentless had not been AIS equipped, but the Fastbreak, Ruiz's boat, had been equipped with a marine GPS chart plotter that logged position data, and as part of the original drug investigation, the Coast Guard had seized the chart plotter and downloaded its data. Chen requested the chart plotter data from the archives. The data showed that on April 3, 2017, the Fastbreak had left a marina in Tavernier at 06:30 a.m., travelled south past Marathon, continued south into open water, and stopped at a position approximately 28 miles south of Key West at 12:47 p.m. The boat remained at that position for approximately 90 minutes, then travelled further south to a position 32 miles south of Key West, remained there for about 30 minutes, then returned north, arriving back at Tavernier at 19:15 p.m. The first position, where the Fastbreak had stopped for 90 minutes, was close to where the Relentless had been found, drifting 2 days later. The second position, further south, was in deep water, over 1,000 feet, the kind of depth where bodies weighted and dropped would never be recovered. The task force now had a timeline. The Brenner family had left Marathon sometime around 8 a.m. on April 3rd. Ruiz, Mendoza, and Santos had followed them, possibly tracking them via radio or simply by keeping them in sight. Once the Brenners were far enough offshore, isolated from other vessels, Ruiz had made his move. He had pulled alongside, boarded the Relentless, and taken the family hostage. He had restrained Catherine with a zip tie, restrained the others with rope or other bindings, and then transported them to a secondary location. What happened next was speculation without witness testimony, but the evidence suggested Ruiz had executed the family and dumped their bodies in deep water. He had then taken the Relentless further offshore, set the engine to neutral, and let it drift, staging the scene to look like the family had abandoned ship for unknown reasons. He and his crew had returned to the Fastbreak and headed back to Tavernier, confident they had committed the perfect crime. The task force needed a witness. They needed someone who had been there, who had seen what happened, who could testify about Ruiz's actions. The obvious candidate was Jorge Santos, who had cooperated in the drug case, and who might be willing to cooperate again if he faced new charges. Santos was living in Homestead, Florida, working as a mechanic at a small garage that specialized in marine engines. FBI agents visited him at his workplace on March 25, 2024, and asked him to come to the field office for an interview. Santos initially refused, said he had nothing to say, said his cooperation in the drug case had been a mistake that had earned him enemies and made his life dangerous. The agents explained that they had evidence linking him to the murder of the Brenner family, that his phone had been in the area on the day of the disappearance, that he could be charged as an accessory to murder if he didn't cooperate. Santos asked for a lawyer. His attorney, a public defender named Maria Ochoa, who had represented him in the drug case, negotiated a proffer agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Under the agreement, Santos could speak with investigators, and his statements would not be used against him in court as long as he told the truth. If he lied, the agreement was void, and he could be prosecuted for perjury and obstruction, in addition to any other charges. The proffer session took place on April 2, 2024, in an interview room at the FBI's Miami field office. Present were Agent Chen, Agent Vega, sitting in as a representative of local law enforcement, Santos, his attorney, and a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The session was recorded on video, standard procedure for proffer agreements. Chen started the interview by reminding Santos that lying would void the agreement and result in prosecution, and that telling the truth was his only path to avoiding murder charges. Santos nodded. He looked exhausted, older than his 43 years, the kind of worn-down look that comes from carrying guilt and fear for too long. He spoke slowly, his voice barely above a whisper at times, and what he said confirmed the task force's worst suspicions and provided details that only someone who had been there could know. Santos said that Victor Ruiz had been enraged when he learned someone had reported the drug cache at the Thunderbolt wreck. The drugs had belonged to a Colombian trafficking organization that Ruiz worked for, an organization that moved cocaine through the Keys using small boats and underwater caches. Losing the drugs meant losing money, losing credibility, and putting Ruiz at risk of retaliation from his bosses. Ruiz had decided he needed to send a message to the organization, to law enforcement, and to anyone else who might think about cooperating with the Coast Guard. Ruiz had bribed a clerk at the Coast Guard station in Marathon, someone with access to case files. The clerk had provided the name of the person who had reported the drugs, Thomas Michael Brenner. Ruiz began surveillance immediately, watching the Brenners' routines, learning their patterns, identifying their boat. He recruited Carlos Mendoza, who owed him money and favors, and Jorge Santos, who was desperate for cash and foolish enough to believe Ruiz when he said they were just going to scare the guy, maybe rough him up a little, teach him a lesson about keeping his mouth shut. On April 2nd, 2017, Ruiz learned through the Marina Grapevine, a network of dock workers and boat owners who knew everyone's business, that the Brenners were planning a family day trip the following day. Ruiz saw an opportunity. He told Santos and Mendoza to meet him at Tavernier early the next morning, bring gloves and rope, and anything else they might need for a job. Santos said he hadn't known what Ruiz was planning, hadn't understood until it was too late. They left Tavernier at dawn, the fast break loaded with extra fuel and supplies. Ruiz told them they were going to intercept the Brenner family offshore, scare them, make sure Thomas Brenner understood that cooperating with law enforcement had consequences. They followed the Relentless south from Marathon, staying far enough back that they wouldn't be noticed, using binoculars to keep the boat in sight. Once the Relentless was about 25 miles offshore, in an area with no other vessels visible, Ruiz opened up the throttles and closed the distance. Santos said he had been horrified when he realized what Ruiz intended. Ruiz pulled the fast break alongside the Relentless and boarded the boat with a gun, a 9mm handgun that he carried under his shirt. Mendoza followed, also armed. Thomas Brenner tried to fight, tried to protect his family, but Ruiz hit him with the gun, knocking him down. Ruiz zip-tied Catherine Brenner's wrists, used rope to tie the children's hands, and forced everyone to sit on the deck while he ranted about what happened to snitches. Santos said he had stayed on the fast break, had watched from a distance, feeling sick, knowing this was wrong, but too scared to intervene. He saw Ruiz force Thomas to his knees. He saw Ruiz point the gun at Thomas's head. He heard Catherine scream. He heard the gunshot, loud even across the water. Thomas fell forward, blood spreading across the deck. Catherine screamed again, and Ruiz shot her. The children were crying, terrified, and Santos thought maybe Ruiz would spare them, would have some mercy. But Ruiz turned to the children and shot them too. Emma first, then Lucas. 4 shots, 4 bodies. Santos said he vomited over the side of the fast break, unable to process what he had just witnessed. Mendoza climbed back onto the fast break and told him to pull himself together, or he'd end up like the Brenners. Ruiz stayed on the Relentless, dragging the bodies to the rail. He weighted each body with dive belts loaded with lead weights, the same weights they used for diving, and rolled them overboard one by one. The bodies sank immediately, disappearing into the blue water, gone. Ruiz spent the next 20 minutes cleaning the blood off the Relentless's deck, using seawater and bleach he had brought for exactly this purpose. He wiped down surfaces, threw the bloody rags overboard, disposed of the shell casings. He set the Relentless's engine to neutral, let the boat drift, and climbed back onto the fast break. They motored south another 4 miles, to a spot where the water was over 1,000 feet deep, and Ruiz checked to make sure there was no blood on the fast break, no evidence linking them to the crime. Then they headed back to Tavernier, arriving after dark. Ruiz told Santos and Mendoza that if they ever spoke about what happened, if they ever went to the police, he would kill them and their families. Santos believed him. He had seen what Ruiz was capable of. So he stayed silent, took his 5-year sentence in the drug case, and tried to forget. But he couldn't forget. He had nightmares, couldn't sleep, couldn't look at his own kids without seeing Emma and Lucas Brenner. When he was released from prison, Santos tried to start over, got the job in Homestead, tried to stay away from anything connected to Ruiz. But the guilt ate at him. And now, with the FBI telling him they had evidence, telling him he could be charged as an accessory to murder, Santos made the decision to tell the truth. He knew it would make him a target, knew Ruiz would come after him, but he couldn't carry the weight anymore. Chen asked Santos if he would be willing to testify in court under oath with the same protections that had been offered in the drug case. Santos said yes. His attorney negotiated a deal. In exchange for his truthful testimony, Santos would plead guilty to being an accessory after the fact to murder, a charge that carried a maximum sentence of 15 years, but that prosecutors would recommend be reduced to time served plus supervised release. Santos agreed. The task force now had enough for an arrest. They had physical evidence. The zip tie with Catherine Brenner's DNA, the chart plotter data showing the fast break at the scene, the phone records placing all 3 suspects in the area. They had Thomas Brenner's logs documenting his fear and identifying his stalkers. And they had an eyewitness willing to testify about what Ruiz and Mendoza had done. On April 15, 2024, FBI agents arrested Victor Manuel Ruiz at his apartment in Miami. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of kidnapping, 1 count of witness intimidation, and 1 count of evidence tampering. He was held without bail, designated a flight risk, and a danger to the community. Carlos Mendoza was arrested the same day at his home in Homestead, charged as an accessory to murder and with evidence tampering. Both men pleaded not guilty and demanded trials. Ruiz hired a high-priced defense attorney, a Miami lawyer named Richard Castellano, who specialized in drug cases and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. Mendoza couldn't afford private counsel and was represented by a federal public defender. The cases were consolidated and set for trial in Federal District Court in Miami. The trial began on November 4, 2024, in the courtroom of Judge Patricia Alvarez. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres, a veteran prosecutor who had tried dozens of violent crime cases. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with over 30 witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence. The prosecution presented Thomas Brenner's logs, reading them aloud in court, letting the jury hear Thomas's voice through his written words. They presented the photographs showing Ruiz and his associates at the marina. They presented the zip tie with Catherine's DNA, the chart plotter data, the phone records, and the forensic analysis of the relentless. And they presented Jorge Santos, who took the stand and testified for 3 days, describing in excruciating detail what had happened on April 3, 2017. He described watching Ruiz execute the Brenner family, described the sound of the gunshots, described the children's screams. He broke down several times on the stand, his voice cracking, tears running down his face, and the jury watched in rapt attention. The defense argued that Santos was lying to save himself, that he was fabricating a story to avoid murder charges, that the physical evidence was circumstantial and could be explained in other ways. Castellano, Ruiz's attorney, argued that the zip tie could have been dropped by anyone who had worked on the boat over the years, that the phone records only showed the defendants were in the area, but not that they had committed a crime, that Santos was an unreliable witness with a criminal record and an incentive to lie. But the prosecution had anticipated these arguments. They presented evidence that the zip tie was a model used exclusively by law enforcement and military, not available in retail stores, meaning it had come from someone connected to law enforcement or criminal activity. They showed that the chart plotter data placed the fast break at the exact location where the Relentless was found, at the exact time when the family disappeared. They corroborated Santos's testimony with details from Thomas Brenner's logs, showing that Santos knew things that could only be known by someone who was present. The most powerful moment of the trial came when the prosecution called Robert and Eleanor Hayes, Catherine Brenner's parents, to testify about their daughter and grandchildren. Eleanor Hayes, now 78 years old, took the stand and described Catherine as a devoted mother and passionate teacher, described Emma and Lucas as bright, happy children who loved swimming and playing on the boat. She showed photographs to the jury: Catherine at her wedding, Emma's school portrait, Lucas holding a fish he'd caught. She spoke about the 7 years of not knowing, the agony of wondering whether they had suffered, whether there was anything she could have done. "We lost our daughter and our grandchildren," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "But we also lost 7 years of closure, 7 years of not knowing the truth, 7 years of wondering if they had been afraid, if they had been in pain. And all because my son-in-law did the right thing. He reported a crime, he cooperated with law enforcement, and he was murdered for it, along with our daughter and our grandchildren. If that's not evil, I don't know what is." The jury deliberated for 4 days. On December 18, 2024, they returned with verdicts: guilty on all counts for Victor Ruiz, guilty on accessory charges for Carlos Mendoza. The courtroom erupted in emotion, Robert and Eleanor Hayes holding each other, crying, while victim advocates sat with them, offering support. Ruiz showed no reaction, staring straight ahead, his face impassive. Mendoza put his head in his hands. Sentencing took place on February 20, 2025. Judge Alvarez heard victim impact statements from the Hayes family, from friends of the Brenners, from former students of Catherine's, from parents of Emma and Lucas's classmates. The statements painted a picture of a family that had been loved, that had made a difference in their community, that had been stolen from the world by an act of senseless violence. Judge Alvarez sentenced Victor Ruiz to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, 1 for each victim, plus additional time for kidnapping and evidence tampering. She called the crime an act of unspeakable cruelty, a deliberate and calculated murder of an innocent family for no reason other than revenge and intimidation. She noted that Ruiz had shown no remorse, had offered no apology, and represented a continuing danger to society. Carlos Mendoza received a sentence of 50 years, with eligibility for parole after serving 35 years. Jorge Santos, who had pleaded guilty and cooperated, received a sentence of time served, 7 years, plus 10 years of supervised release. He was released from custody immediately after sentencing, entering the witness protection program due to credible threats against his life. The case drew national and international media attention. The story of the family that vanished and the locker found in a coral cave became the subject of extensive coverage in newspapers, magazines, and television news programs. Major networks produced hour-long specials examining the case. The Discovery Channel and Netflix both produced documentary series exploring the investigation and the broader issues of witness protection and drug trafficking violence in South Florida. If you've stayed with this investigation all the way through the trial and sentencing, then I hope you'll consider subscribing and turning on notifications, because there are more stories like this. Stories where ordinary people become targets of violence, where evidence waits years to be discovered, and where justice, when it finally comes, arrives through the dedication of investigators who refuse to give up. The case sparked significant policy changes. The Coast Guard and DEA implemented new protocols for protecting witnesses in drug cases. The new protocols included enhanced security measures, anonymous reporting systems that shielded witnesses' identities from case files accessible during discovery, and comprehensive victim witness assistance programs that provided relocation support, financial assistance, and ongoing security assessments. The Florida legislature passed legislation in 2025 called the Brenner Family Protection Act, which increased penalties for crimes committed in retaliation for cooperation with law enforcement. The law made it a first-degree felony, punishable by life in prison, to harm or threaten any witness or informant in a drug trafficking case. The law also established a state-funded program to provide security and relocation assistance to witnesses who faced credible threats. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida used the Brenner case as a template for improving witness protection in federal prosecutions. They established a task force specifically dedicated to identifying threats against cooperating witnesses and providing resources to keep them safe. The task force included personnel from the FBI, DEA, U.S. Marshal Service, and local law enforcement agencies. Elena Vasquez, the dive charter captain whose client had discovered the locker, received commendations from the Coast Guard, the FBI, and the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. She was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about the importance of reporting unusual finds and treating underwater locations as potential crime scenes. She continued operating La Sirena out of Key West, though she no longer took groups to the cathedral without first briefing them on the site's history. She placed a memorial plaque in the chamber where the locker had been found, installed with permission from the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. The plaque read, "In memory of the Brenner family, Thomas, Catherine, Emma, and Lucas, who loved the ocean and were taken too soon. May they rest in peace beneath these waves." Robert Chen, the diver who had first spotted the locker, became deeply involved in underwater forensic work. He completed advanced training in evidence recovery, earned certifications in forensic diving and underwater crime scene investigation, and began volunteering with law enforcement agencies across Florida to assist in underwater searches. He co-founded a non-profit organization called Underwater Evidence Recovery, which provided volunteer divers and equipment to law enforcement agencies investigating cases involving submerged evidence. The organization helped solve 9 additional cold cases in its first 3 years of operation. Senior Chief Marcus Holland retired from the Coast Guard in 2026 with full honors after 28 years of service. He was awarded the Coast Guard Medal for his work on the Brenner case, recognizing his dedication and investigative skill. He stayed in Key West and worked as a consultant for maritime investigations, continuing to assist law enforcement agencies with cold cases and complex maritime crimes. He maintained regular contact with the Hayes family, visiting them several times a year and keeping them updated on developments in maritime law enforcement. Detective Sergeant Sarah Vega was promoted to lieutenant in 2025 and given command of the Monroe County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit. She used the Brenner investigation as a model for reviving other unsolved cases, particularly those involving maritime incidents. Her unit solved 6 additional cold cases in the first 2 years, bringing closure to families who had waited years for answers. The Brenner family was laid to rest in a cemetery in Marathon overlooking the ocean. The funeral, held on March 15, 2025, was attended by over 500 people, family members, friends, former students, and colleagues of Catherine's, members of the Marathon community, law enforcement officers who had worked the case, and even some strangers who had followed the story in the media and felt compelled to pay their respects. The service included a reading from Thomas Brenner's logs, selected passages that showed his love for his family and his commitment to doing what was right. A Navy dive team performed a missing man formation in the water offshore, a ceremonial tribute to a family lost to the ocean. Robert and Eleanor Hayes established the Brenner Family Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to supporting children of crime victims and providing financial assistance for education, counseling, and basic needs. The foundation also funded scholarships for students interested in marine biology, oceanography, and maritime law enforcement, fields that Thomas and Catherine had loved and that represented the family's connection to the sea. The first scholarships were awarded in 2026 to 5 students from Marathon High School. The case prompted changes in recreational boating safety regulations. The Coast Guard began requiring all boats over 26 feet in length to carry EPIRB devices and to register them with the Coast Guard's National Distress System. The regulation also encouraged but did not mandate the installation of AIS transponders on recreational vessels, recognizing that real-time tracking could save lives in emergencies. Within 2 years, voluntary AIS installation on recreational boats increased by over 40%. The media coverage of the case led to renewed scrutiny of the so-called Bermuda Triangle mythology and the tendency to attribute disappearances to mysterious forces. Maritime safety experts and oceanographers used the Brenner case as an example of how disappearances that seemed inexplicable often had rational explanations: mechanical failure, weather, human error, or in this case, deliberate violence. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration published a report examining maritime disappearances in the Florida Straits and Caribbean, concluding that the rate of incidents in the so-called Bermuda Triangle was no higher than in any other heavily trafficked area of ocean, and that attributing disappearances to supernatural causes was both scientifically unfounded and disrespectful to the victims and their families. In 2026, a journalist named Rebecca Stone published a book about the Brenner case titled The Locker: How a Family's Murder Was Solved by Evidence Hidden Beneath the Sea. The book became a bestseller, combining investigative journalism with personal stories from the Hayes family, law enforcement officials, and others touched by the case. Stone had spent over a year researching, conducting interviews, reviewing court documents, and diving the cathedral to see the site where the locker had been found. The book was praised for its thorough reporting and its sensitive handling of the family's tragedy. The book's proceeds were donated to the Brenner Family Foundation, generating substantial funds that allowed the foundation to expand its programs. Stone appeared on numerous television and radio programs to discuss the case, and she used the platform to advocate for stronger witness protection laws and for better support for families of crime victims. She also emphasized the role that ordinary citizens, divers like Robert Chen, boat captains like Elena Vasquez, could play in solving crimes by being observant and willing to report unusual finds. In 2027, the Discovery Channel produced a documentary series titled Evidence from the Deep, examining cases where underwater discoveries had led to breakthroughs in criminal investigations. The Brenner case was featured as the series' premiere, with extensive interviews with investigators, family members, and expert analysis of the forensic work. The episode included underwater footage of the cathedral, reenactments of the locker's discovery and the subsequent investigation, and courtroom footage from the trial. The episode concluded with a segment on the memorial plaque in the cathedral and a reflection on how the ocean, despite its vastness and mystery, could yield evidence that brought justice to victims. The documentary was nominated for several Emmy Awards and won in the category of Outstanding Investigative Documentary. The series sparked renewed interest in cold cases involving maritime incidents, and several law enforcement agencies reported increases in tips and leads after episodes aired. The publicity helped solve 3 additional cases featured in later episodes, demonstrating the power of media attention in generating new information. Eleanor Hayes, who had become a spokesperson for the Brenner Family Foundation and an advocate for crime victims' rights, was invited to testify before Congress in 2028 about the need for stronger federal witness protection programs. She spoke about her family's experience, about the failure of the system to protect Thomas Brenner after he cooperated with law enforcement, and about the 7 years of anguish that could have been avoided if proper protections had been in place. Her testimony was instrumental in the passage of the Witness Safety Enhancement Act, which increased funding for witness protection programs and established stricter protocols for threat assessment and security planning. The Hayes family also worked with the Coast Guard to establish an annual memorial award in honor of Thomas Brenner, recognizing civilians who assist in maritime law enforcement investigations. The first recipient was Robert Chen, honored for his role in discovering the locker and for his subsequent volunteer work in underwater evidence recovery. Chen accepted the award at a ceremony in Key West, where he spoke about the importance of being observant and of trusting one's instincts when something seems wrong. In 2029, the city of Marathon dedicated a small waterfront park in honor of the Brenner family. The park featured a memorial sculpture, a bronze representation of a family of 4 standing together looking out toward the ocean, and informational plaques describing their story and the importance of witness protection. The park became a gathering place for the community, a quiet spot where people could reflect on the fragility of life and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. The Brenner case remained a touchstone in maritime law enforcement and criminal justice education. It was studied in law schools, police academies, and investigative training programs as an example of how cold cases could be solved through physical evidence, witness cooperation, and persistent investigative work. It was also used as a case study in courses on witness protection, drug trafficking, and maritime crime, illustrating the complexities of investigating crimes that occur offshore and the challenges of protecting witnesses in organized crime cases. Marcus Holland, in his retirement, wrote a detailed case study of the Brenner investigation for the FBI's Law Enforcement Bulletin, examining the investigative techniques that had led to the breakthrough and offering recommendations for other investigators working similar cases. The article was widely read and cited, and it became required reading in many law enforcement training programs. Holland also taught a course on maritime investigations at Florida International University, using the Brenner case as a primary example. The case also had a personal impact on many of those involved. Jorge Santos, living under a new identity in witness protection, struggled with guilt and trauma, but eventually found work as a substance abuse counselor, using his own experiences to help others avoid the paths that had led him to crime and tragedy. He remained in contact with the Hayes family through intermediaries, sending letters apologizing for his role and expressing his determination to make amends through his work, helping others. Elena Vasquez continued diving and operating her charter business, but she approached every dive with a heightened awareness of the ocean's dual nature, its beauty and its capacity to hide human tragedies. She trained her dive masters to watch for unusual objects and to report anything suspicious, and she incorporated discussions of underwater forensics into her dive briefings. Several of her clients were inspired to pursue careers in marine science and law enforcement after hearing the Brenner story. Robert Chen's non-profit, Underwater Evidence Recovery, expanded its operations to include training programs for law enforcement divers, equipment donations to underfunded agencies, and public education about the importance of underwater crime scene investigation. The organization partnered with universities to develop new technologies for underwater evidence detection, including improved sonar systems and remotely operated vehicles designed specifically for forensic applications. The Cathedral Dive site became something of a pilgrimage destination for divers who had followed the Brenner case. Many made the dive specifically to see the memorial plaque and to pay their respects in the chamber where the locker had been found. Elena Vasquez noticed that divers who visited the site often emerged from the water with a different attitude, more thoughtful, more appreciative of the ocean's complexity, more aware that diving was not just recreation, but also a form of bearing witness to the stories hidden beneath the surface. In 2030, on the 13th anniversary of the Brenner family's murder, a memorial service was held at the cathedral. Elena Vasquez organized a dive with family members, law enforcement officials, and members of the community. Divers descended to the memorial chamber and placed flowers, specially treated silk flowers that would not degrade and pollute the environment, near the plaque. Robert and Eleanor Hayes, now in their mid-80s, participated via a live video feed from a boat on the surface, watching as divers paid tribute to their family. After the dive, there was a small gathering on the boat. Eleanor Hayes, speaking to the assembled group, reflected on the 7 years of not knowing and the years since the truth had been revealed. Thomas tried to protect us, even after he was gone, she said. He left that locker because he knew something might happen, and he wanted to make sure the truth would come out. It took 7 years, but the truth did come out. And because of that, because Thomas thought ahead, and because good people like all of you worked so hard to find the truth, Victor Ruiz will spend the rest of his life in prison. That doesn't bring them back. Nothing will bring them back. But it means they didn't die for nothing. Their deaths led to changes, better witness protection, better laws, more awareness, and maybe, just maybe, other families won't have to go through what we went through. The words resonated with everyone present, and they became a refrain in discussions about the case. A reminder that tragedy could sometimes lead to positive change, that justice mattered even when it came late, and that the work of investigators, witnesses, and ordinary citizens who paid attention could make a difference. The ocean off Key West remains beautiful and treacherous, a place where turquoise water conceals coral caves and deep channels, where sunlight and shadow create landscapes that are both inviting and unforgiving. Divers come from around the world to explore the reefs and wrecks, to swim through the cathedral and other underwater landmarks, to experience the wonder of a world that is alien and familiar at once. Most dive without thinking about the human stories hidden in the depths, the evidence that lies waiting to be discovered, the families whose losses are commemorated only by plaques and memories. But some divers, those who have heard the story of the Brenner family, those who dive the cathedral and see the memorial plaque, those who understand that every reef and wreck and cave holds fragments of human experience, dive with a different awareness. They look at the coral formations and the sandy bottoms and the hidden crevices with new eyes, understanding that the ocean is not just a place of recreation, but also a repository of human stories, a place where secrets are kept and sometimes revealed, where justice can be delayed but not forever denied. And when they surface, when they climb back onto the boat and remove their masks and feel the sun on their faces, they carry with them the knowledge that every dive is an act of exploration, not just of the ocean's physical spaces, but of the human stories the ocean holds. Stories of joy and tragedy, of courage and fear, of families who loved the water and who were taken by it or taken on it, and of the enduring human need to know the truth, to understand what happened, to ensure that those who are lost are not forgotten, and that those responsible for their loss are held accountable. The locker that Thomas Brenner sealed and hid in a coral cave at 90 feet was more than just a container of documents and photographs. It was an act of foresight and love, a father's determination to protect his family, even in death, a citizen's commitment to ensuring that a crime would not go unpunished. It was a message sent across 7 years of silence, a message that said, "I saw something. I reported it. They came after me because of it. Don't let them win." And because of that message, because good people found it and refused to ignore it, Victor Ruiz did not win. The truth came out. Justice was served. And the Brenner family, though they could never be brought back, were given the dignity of being remembered not as victims who mysteriously vanished, but as people who were murdered for doing what was right, and whose courage in the face of evil helped change laws and protect others. Their story is a reminder that the ocean keeps secrets, but it also gives them up. That evidence can persist for years in the most unlikely places. That ordinary people, divers looking for adventure, investigators following leads, witnesses finding the courage to speak, can make extraordinary differences. And that justice, when it finally arrives, carries a weight and meaning that transcends the years of waiting, bringing closure not just to families, but to communities, and serving as a testament to the enduring human belief that truth matters, that lives matter, and that no act of violence should ever go unanswered.